On today's episode, we learn how trustworthy the FBI is, how the government should force your kids to attend a drag queen story time, and a whole bunch of gun facts, like how in order to be a constitutional originalist, you can only support owning muskets, how racism is good if it means gun control, and why Americans should be disarmed but Ukrainians shouldn't. This is Cringe Posts. Hello, friends. Welcome to this episode of the Cringe Posts podcast. This is the show where we gather the cringiest political and cultural takes that we see in our feed, and we break down where they went wrong, and hopefully we have a laugh along the way. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host, Britt. We're going to go ahead and dive into looking at some of these cringy posts from our feeds, but before we do that, we always start by making fun of our own past cringy posts, because let's admit it, we all have bad posts. Before we do that, however, just a reminder to leave a like or a comment on this video if you're watching on YouTube or Odyssey, or leave a good rating for us. If you're listening on a podcast platform, that would be greatly appreciated. It helps us grow, and we love to see it. And just share it with a friend if you are enjoying the content. And then if you want to see the posts, the social media posts that we roast here, you can always do that at cringeposts.com, where we post a visual companion as well, if you are listening to that. They are always available on the video feed as well. So, all that being said, let's get into our own cringy posts from the past. And today we get to roast Britt, who on November 19 of 2010 shared on Facebook, "Which Star Wars Jedi/Sith are you?" And don't worry, he got his result. And he got Obi-Wan Kenobi misspelled.
Yeah.
It's spelled Obi-Wan Kenobi, like I won the
with
battle.
An O. Yes,
yeah, with an O instead of an A there.
Here's the thing that made me cringe about this. So Obi-Wan is my favorite Star Wars character for sure, by far. And so I'm 99% sure that I took this quiz and I took it trying to get Obi-Wan.
Yeah. Right.
And then once I did get it, I was like, this is so cool. I got to share it to everyone. And even though this is 2010, I guess I'm like 16 or something like that at that time. Like, It's still just embarrassing, man. Like,
I remember, these kinds of quizzes were just blew up, and it seems like they never really died. I think
they're still around.
Yeah, well, and not to mention there's modern iterations of the exact same thing where you'll have the TikTok trends of, or other social, doesn't have to be TikTok, of some filter of like a bunch of different things, like, I don't know, like Pokemon or something, and it's like cycling through them rapidly, and then you pause and stop.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, that's what you are. And I'm sure that there are those people who just do the thing until they get the one they want, and then they share, wow, look what I got. I can recall a time, growing up, I was very into Lego's Bionicles, that series. And I remember they had a quiz like this, like, which Toa are you? Those were sort of the main characters. And I remember sort of being disillusioned because when taking the quiz, I remember it being so transparent about which thing correlated with which person. Like one of the characters, his action was he could kick things really well. And I don't remember even what the prompt was. It was like, if you were supposed to clean your room and your mom's coming up, what do you do in your room? Like, and you haven't cleaned it. And it was like, one of the answers was like, kick all your clothes under the bed and say you have to go save the world or something. And I'm like, that's obviously going for this guy here. That's so dumb. No one would ever do that or say that. And so I was very disillusioned with this kind of thing early on. But I'm glad you got to share your Obi-Wan victory.
Oh, yes, yeah. I loved Bionicle, too. I can't remember the guy's name, but my favorite was the green guy.
Lewa. Yeah.
Lewa, yep.
See, the nice thing, I don't know if you did this, my brother and I, we sort of split everything. So he would get, because they always came out in sixes, so it was like he'd get 3, I'd get 3. And that way we divided and conquered. So that was a David. That was a David one. I didn't have Lewa, but
okay. Yeah. So what were your 3? What were your 3 that you had?
I usually got whatever was fire, water, and then the other one kind of changed. So sometimes like rock, sometimes earth. It depended, but yeah.
Those are such cool toys, man. They were like just all the mechanics in them and things. And what were those guys like? They would go into a ball and then they would strike.
Oh, the Borok. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. They were really cool.
And what's really fun is I don't know if you ever read the comics along with them, but they had the whole comics, and I loved reading those at the time. It was really good story building, really good world development, and it went on quite some time beyond when I stopped receiving the comics at a certain point. But from the beginning, the entire thing's actually a giant metaphor for cancer, and so like the cells that they come in, the very canisters that the toys come in are representing cells of like white blood cells to go in and root out cancer.
Oh, I
and
didn't
the
know
boron.
that.
Yeah, it's actually wild, super deep, very off topic, but very cool. If anyone wants to know why Bionicle has such a strong fan base, it's really good story writing, and it was planned from the beginning. Super in depth, super detailed, super cool. Okay,
Nice. All right.
enough with that.
Moving on.
We'll move on to other people here. So this post is from verified Steve Metz, who I snipped this and I realized I don't even know who this guy is, but he's replying to Justin Amash, and Justin Amash had tweeted something about gun rights and the Second Amendment. And Steve Metz replies, I'm a constitutional originalist, so I believe that every member of a well-regulated militia has an inalienable right to hold and bear a muzzle while loading weapon. Bear a muzzle loading weapon. All other gun rights are determined by legislation. And this one, I wanted to specifically signal. We've got a couple of gun ones in here, but this one, I don't know that we've necessarily specifically addressed this very common recurring criticism of the Second Amendment is, well, at the time they only had muskets or it was, they didn't want people to have weapons of war. And the first response is no. These were the weapons of war, right? Like these kinds of muskets and these kinds of things, though that was the equivalent of their weapons of war. That was the most, common type of arm that you were going to have and carry. So to say that that's static and to say that that is the kind of thing that an originalist would freeze on, that's silly. No originalist thinks that you don't apply the original principle. That's the entire argument. An originalist doesn't think you take the static word and say the free speech only applies to, ink and quill and carrier pigeons. Obviously, an originalist interpretation of the Constitution means that you take what the original meaning is, and meaning implies principle. So, very stupid argument there. But secondly, automatic weapons existed back then, and the colonists were well aware of their existing. German, I want to say German mercenaries brought them over when they were hired and conscripted in the Revolutionary War. This kind of thing was not common for every person to have, but it was the technology to have some sort of a machine gun. It was, I believe they set up on sort of a stand and had automatic firing, right? Not just like a single fire and a full reload. So that kind of thing did exist, and there are specifically no differentiations between those types of weapons and what is explicitly allowed in the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment does not delineate, because the idea is that individuals should have the weapons of war, because the whole point is that they're rebelling against a government that had fallen into tyranny, and their entire principle is, yes, every man has the right to fight against tyranny. Therefore, everyone has an inalienable right to self-defense using whatever weapons of war are available.
Yeah, to kind of add on to that point, and we talked about, I think it was last episode or the episode before, that at Lexington and Concord, facilitated the actual conflict where the redcoats came and were trying to actually came into battle with the colonialists, is that they wanted to take people's guns because they were threatened by the fact that these people had armories and armaments, the very armaments that this guy is trying to kind of single out. And the British Empire, the greatest superpower in the whole world at that time, viewed the weapons that every colonist had as a threat to their ruling. So obviously these weapons were weapons of war. And the people that wrote the Constitution viewed them as weapons of war, and they weren't trying to be like, oh, it's just for hunting. Like you were saying, it's the principle of the ability to defend yourself against tyranny, whether it's foreign or domestic. You mentioned you didn't know who Steve Metz was. I didn't know who he was either, but I just Googled him. And what's so ironic, man, is this is the guy who was he was part of the think tanks that kind of advised the Bush and Obama administrations on counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan. So you'd think you would think this guy, this guy would understand, because that's once you get past the principle argument, these people say, well, okay, sure, like, yeah, you want to be able to defend yourself, but are you going to really let yourself have a rocket launcher or a nuke? And one, the answer is yes. If you can get one, then great. That's awesome. Most people can't. But then two, even if you can't get those things, having a whole town or population armed with even something as simple as an AR-15, as we've seen, and this guy should know by his counterinsurgency advice that obviously didn't work out so well in the Middle East. A bunch of goat herders were able to take on the greatest superpower on the earth just by having some AK-47s and some good tactics and knowledge of kind of the environment around them. So, yeah, it's just this dead on arrival, and it's disingenuous and a lie, right? Like this is purposefully misconstruing what the Constitution says in order for them to gain more power, which makes it evil.
Yeah, I think that it's very easy to be tripped up by that kind of thing, right? To hear, oh, if you're actually an originalist, then you would support gun rights of what they had at the original time. And it's, once again, this very common recurring theme of taking a term and just twisting it, misusing it, misapplying it, where an originalist, and here's the thing, you and I think we would both agree that a society that kept to the Constitution might be the most libertarian society we've had, but we aren't gonna die on the altar of the Constitution. No. That being said, still, if you're arguing that a constitutional originalist should hold to that standard, you actually have to, argue from the perspective of what a constitutional originalist believes, instead of saying something that's entirely counterintuitive to that point. So a constitutional originalist is going to understand the meaning at the time and the principle of that meaning, not just the snapshot isolation of that year and then frozen in time. That's what you apply forward. That's a misapplication of what an originalist would hold to that no one actually does, right?
Yep.
So it's just disingenuous and silly. So, but it's a take we hadn't quite tackled yet, so I wanted to include it.
Yeah, I like it.
Okay. Next series of tweets. Here we have Grant Hermes, probably. I'm not familiar with him, but he is a blue check mark, and he's reporting, and he says, confirmed, FBI is executing a search warrant at the Allendale home of Ryan Kelly. There's also an arrest warrant out for him. Kelly is a current GOP governor candidate, polling around 19%. The top of the field right now. He was also on the Capitol steps on January 6th. And someone else replies to that saying, so he was on the Capitol steps, but not in the Capitol? This might completely blow up on their face if that's all he did. And someone else replies saying, the FBI doesn't arrest people like this unless it's pretty solid. Way too visual if the evidence doesn't support the optics. And this is just really funny that someone's going in carrying water for the FBI. Like, they're this noble, virtuous institution. The FBI wouldn't do anything that was, that was kind of sketchy. They'd only arrest someone if there was the firmest foundation of evidence and truth for them to do that. And I mean, this is just somewhat, demonstrably false even right now, as we're having all these January 6th commission stuff going on. And Thomas Massey very rightfully asked Merrick Garland, the attorney general who's leading this investigation. I hope you can hear the derision in my voice. He asks him about this video where there is the one individual in the crowd on January 6th who's saying, we're going to storm the Capitol and we're going to take it over or whatever. And the crowd around this dude starts booing him. And they start saying, you're a Fed, because that wasn't the intent of the January 6th protests initially. And this is probably the most popular video that started coming out from that, and then I think was really tried to be smushed down. But he's the single most visible demonstrator calling for this kind of thing. So you would think that if the FBI were to bring someone in on evidence, it would be him. And so anyway, so Massey asks if the investigation has led up to this guy, and Merrick Garland says, "We don't comment on the investigation." And it's like, why are you in a hearing about the investigation if you don't comment on the investigation? It's because they don't want to admit it. Now, I'm not saying that this guy was inciting as a mole from the FBI or other, but it's very, very suspicious, and it's something that you would actually want a January 6th commission that's supposed to be investigating it to show up, is maybe figure out who the guy who's actually calling for and inciting the crowd to go in, a crowd who is obviously resistant to that idea by booing him and calling him a Fed. Like that to me is pretty striking. And the fact that that guy is not arrested, that guy is not the target of the FBI, I think demonstrates that the FBI isn't very interested in arresting people with solid evidence. They're very interested in arresting people that's going to help further a power and political agenda.
Yeah, it's always so funny to me, like the amount of veneration and legitimacy people will give to like the FBI, to the point where they will ask the FBI to like do things or investigate things that the FBI has no. It's like that's not their job to do. So I remember when Kavanaugh was being confirmed, and they tried to all these people saying different things about him, and everyone's like, "We need to have a real FBI investigation." It's like, okay, like that's not necessarily who would do that, right? But because it's like, oh, the FBI is legit because of Criminal Minds and all the different shows that have come out. Right. Like it's so legitimized in people's brains. Yep. The other thing that people don't realize is like this is not a trustworthy organization. None of the alphabet soup organizations are. You think about like J. Edgar Hoover and how he managed to stay in power for decades and basically influence who became or who did not become president. And then you think about like I think Ryan Kelly's like the governor candidate for Michigan. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. That sounds about it. Maybe
which is really I think he is. So what's ironic about that is there's a whole hubbub about the people going to go kidnap the Governor Whitmer because she was imprisoning people in their houses. Yep. And it turned out it's like, of the 16 people that were conspiring to go kidnap her, 12 of them were FBI informants, and then the 3 people that like actually like spurred the kidnapping plot to happen were FBI agents. So it's just it's kind of like it's like, oh, I don't know, that's kind of weird, and I wouldn't trust that. And then you get to the fact that like, okay, Ryan Kelly has a legit chance of challenging a Democratic governor, and it's been a year and a half since January 6th happened, and now all of a sudden, right when he's starting to pull ahead, they decide, oh, this was such a great threat that a year and a half later we're going to go pick him up and start harassing him. It's like, oh, this looks kind of more like something that would happen like Venezuela or in North Korea. Right before it became total authoritarian. Like it's where the organizations and bureaucracy that's perceived as legitimate is weaponized against the political opposition. You never saw any of this. They were so fast in tracking down the people at January 6th that were just around the protest. They used all this facial recognition, all this stuff. And, there was a broken window and a woman that was on the side of the protest got shot by a cop. But during all of Black Lives Matter, with the $20 billion in damage done, with when all the different Senate hearings for confirming like Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett were getting barged into, and people were intruding in the Capitol and stuff. For some reason, mysteriously, the FBI couldn't track these people down. So it seems like it really goes only one way. And then it all comes out, right, that after all these Russia conspiracy hoaxes and all this stuff, it's like, oh, they didn't actually have anything on it, and they were conspiring to overthrow the sitting president of the United States, Donald Trump. And it's like any legitimacy you thought that the FBI had is now gone. We can't trust a word they say, but these people don't read, and they just get their headline from CNN or their information from CNN headlines, and that's it.
Absolutely. Could not have said it better myself. All right. This next post, there was a thread that Spike Cohen, guest of the show a while back here, he had been talking about gun rights, and in that conversation, someone had replied to Spike with a picture of Maj Toure, who is the founder of the organization Black Guns Matter. I believe that's the name, and he's a very big educational influencer on guns and gun rights, gun ownership, and all kinds of things. He's really great. Check him out. He's super interesting and well spoken, and got a lot of really good insight as well as just practical knowledge that you can learn from him. And anyway, they post a picture of him wearing a shirt or whatever, and this this joker here quote retweets the picture of Maj Toure, and in reference to the guy posting that picture says, "This guy is using an image of a black model from a t-shirt store to do gun advocacy. I'm sharing it for laughs only. He probably found it by Googling black people who are pro-guns." And what I love about this is how much of a self-own this is. This is the perfect example of the white, well, I actually don't know if this person's white, but it reeks at least. Picture. Yeah, it's a dog in their picture, which is kind of white thing to do. It reeks of the white person coming in and is gonna explain how racism works and how black people are objectified and how they're villainized, all the while committing the bigotry of soft and low expectations. And it's like, oh, yeah, look, he just found some picture of a guy in a t-shirt store who's pro-guns. No, actually in libertarian circles, especially that are going to be, online here, we're actually kind of big fans of Maj Toure, and we don't just try to, diminish his work by just being, oh, he's a black token person. And that's what, I don't think of Maj Toure as a black libertarian. I think of him as the gun guy. That's his expertise. And his organization is Black Guns Matter, and he's appealing to the urban communities. But like, first and foremost, he's a gun guy. That's how he is in my mind. But it just betrays how progressives cannot help but identify, categorize, and characterize people by their skin tone. The complete opposite of the ideals they preach every Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that he does get right is the guy, Maj Toure's a good-looking dude, so I guess he can be a model. Yeah, and this is kind of a common thing you hear on the left about guns. It's like when all other arguments fail, it's like, well, I calculate, I got to do racism somehow. And you've probably seen it, but Joy Behar on The View had that thing this week where she basically said, she's like, hey, just wait until black people start getting guns, then gun control will actually happen. As she's saying this to a black woman who does own firearms, which is really ironic. Yeah, they don't understand this type of argument that, oh, well, Republicans only want to have guns to keep people down, or libertarians only are 2A because they're racist or whatever. Maybe for Republicans, I have no idea. I'm not a Republican. I'm a libertarian. But it's like, no, we adhere to a principle, which is that every single person, regardless of whether they're black or white or straight or gay or anything like that, is able to defend themselves, which means owning a gun. And so, yeah, if black people, for whatever reason, maybe black people own guns 10-1 compared to white people, it's like, great. Like, now we need to make sure that white people start having more guns too, right? Because we want everyone to be able to defend themselves. And, Maj Toure makes some really great points. I encourage anyone to go, kind of check out what he's doing. Because he kind of comes at it from the standpoint of like, hey, if you want to solve some of these violent issues, in the inner city and in urban areas, it's like, it's not solved by confiscating guns and letting only the people that want to break laws to have these weapons. It's solved by good people having weapons and there being an equal distribution of force so that no one ends up actually using it. So he's really great on that. And it's like, yeah, man, if you think about, like people that are most likely to be hurt by violent crime, those are the people, the innocent people, the people that are good, upstanding people. Those are the type of people that should and are hurt the most by by gun control legislation, because they need the gun the most, yet they can't get it in time. They've got to wait a certain amount of period of time or whatever, and therefore they're left as a sitting duck, and they can't defend themselves.
And you think about how much of a failure the police have been in these situations, and it makes you wonder all the more why you would want to disarm the people who are going to be present when the very real threat of gang violence is there. And let's grant the idea that the very implausible, unrealistic, and fantasy land idea that if you enacted gun control, there would be no guns on the streets. Let's just say that for the case. Well, then let's look at a similar comparison of somewhere like England, where you have communities of Islamic extremists who run certain boroughs of the city of London and areas nearby that's under sort of their religious control. And women are assaulted all the time. There are thousands of acid attacks, and the cops just choose not to patrol those areas. They don't go in because they don't want to deal with acid attacks. And so you think, okay, why on earth would you disarm the areas where gang violence is prevalent, where gangs will get guns, but even if they didn't, they will still show up in force, ready to scrap, ready to knife fight. And now you've disarmed a community that is no longer able to show any kind of force. The great thing about specifically guns is that you can now make someone who is maybe not as physically born tough, who's maybe not gotten in a scrap in their life, they haven't lived that rough life where they grew up in a gang and knowing that culture, and you've equalized the playing field, because when you give him a gun, he's on the same level as that person who's been brawling their whole life and is ready to cut that guy's throat if it comes to it, right? And again, the cops, best case scenario, are going to show up 11 minutes late, if at all.
Yeah, that's the old saying, God made man, but Samuel Colt made them equal.
Right, exactly.
Which is great quote. I don't own any Colts, but yeah, I hear they're pretty good. But anyone that is, thinking about this, or maybe is on the fence about stuff, or maybe you're a little bit more like want to have a centrist or moderate position where you think something like, well, maybe we don't need AR-15s, but maybe we should only have handguns or whatever. I'd encourage you, go out and try shooting. Go to a range. Very, very safe. Probably one of the safest places you'll ever go in a lot of ways. Go to a gun range. See if you can rent a handgun, and then also rent an AR-15, and just try shooting them and see the difference between them and why someone might want one versus the other in certain different types of situations, because it becomes abundantly clear because these are tools, right? They have very specific parameters and specifications that make them really useful in different situations. And I think that will help, even if it doesn't persuade you that everyone should own one, it will help you understand why people would want to own one or maybe both versus another. Because at the end of the day, it's about the people that own these things, and the vast majority of them own them to do something defensive. And to understand how these tools are used, a hammer versus a drill is pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to wrap it up, I own personal protection ammo with my gun and I own it because I hope I never have to use it, right? Like, no one buys the gun thing, oh boy, can't wait to stir up some violence. Like, there are some psychopaths, but those psychopaths are going to stir up violence. By and large, when you buy a weapon, it's as a tool to defend yourself. And should we need it to stop tyranny? And that is not only a great byproduct, but the point of the Second Amendment. So, okay, moving on. We've got a legislator in Texas on the state level who is posting a press release, and his tweet reads, "Drag shows are no place for a child. I would never take my children to a drag show, and I know Speaker Dade Phelan and my Republican colleagues wouldn't either. I will be filing legislation to address this issue in the new Texas legislature." And so basically he's filing a bill that would ban drag shows in the presence of minors in Texas. And so then this California state representative, quote, retweets this, saying, "This guy just gave me a bill idea. Offering Drag Queen 101 as part of the K through 12 curriculum. Attending drag queen story time will satisfy the requirement." And what's crazy to me about this is, on the one hand, there's the kind of the what some libertarians might say is like, you can't ban, these, drag shows in the presence of children, because, it's not an inherently sexual thing. You can't, and to me, it's like, look, I don't know of any kind of drag show that is not sexual in nature. I think Dave Smith and Robbie the Fire Bernstein made the joke that it's like, yeah, okay, maybe if it's a drag show where they're like Mrs. Doubtfire and it's that's the that's the act, but
yeah, you don't see many of those, do you?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's not really the point, right? But the point is like a minor is not developed to the point where they are sexual in nature and ready for that kind of thing. And so to expose a child to that and to put them in that way, I think is very easily a case of sexual abuse of a child. Now, not in the same way of sexual abuse as like physical, but it is a form of exposing them to inappropriate content. And so that kind of a ban to me makes sense. Now, again, you can call me not libertarian for supporting that kind of thing, and it would be very specific on how you'd have to enact it. But the larger point here is that the idea that this person is suggesting, and I don't know if they're saying it just to sort of rile up people and it's tongue in cheek, or if this is a serious consideration. But I just remember the days growing up when the arguments in support of, legalizing gay marriage and stuff was like, we just want to live our life. We just don't want to be shut down and harassed. And quite literally, you now have this person legislating, or at least legislating mandatory drag queen classes in the public education system, and putting, someone in the K through 12 in a drag queen story time would satisfy that requirement. That is the most revolting and reviling kind of use of state force in public education that I can imagine.
Yeah, it's looking at these things, it's almost, I can't believe we have to say, hey, this probably isn't a good thing to do. Or I don't even need to say probably. I just know it's not a good
Right.
thing to put a kid, any kid of any age, of any sex, in a bar with a bunch of men that have obviously some sort of identity issue, dressed scantily clad, and trying to have kids put money in their underwear. Like this, it's just there's something really, I think it's like, at face value, this is probably not good. And, I've seen some people say things like, oh, well, would you say the same thing about, Hooters, or take a kid to Hooters or whatever, or Twin Peaks or whatever? It's like, well, yeah, I don't think that's good either.
Right,
So yeah, but it's still, that is not as bad, right? You don't, if you had a kid go to Hooters, and if I had a son and I took him to Hooters, I said, okay, we're going to go to Hooters, and I want you to tell the waitress to, dance. And I want you, when she does, you put your money in her, underwear and all this stuff. Like, I'd be a terrible parent. And I think everyone that looked at me and said I was a terrible parent would be correct. And so it's just, and it's even with that, at least it's like, it's still bending in the direction of, it's bad. I don't agree with any of that, but it's still somewhat natural because it's a boy looking at a woman, right? Like, there's still some like biological truth and consistency in that way. Whereas this other way, it's like, no, you're taking kids to this. I think they literally called it drag your kid to pride, because you're trying to change their fundamental truths and sexuality and biological realities that they have about them. So it's like multiple levels deep wrong. And to be clear, again, like, I do not support taking your kid to Hooters. I don't think even an adult should go to Hooters. That's not the type of morality I subscribe to. I'm monogamous, and I believe in the sanctity of marriage and all that. But it just really speaks to the levels of depravity, right? Like, just 15 years ago, if you said, oh yeah, I took my 4-year-old to Hooters, everyone would be like, dude, what the hell's wrong with you?
Right.
Like, and now it's like, it's not even what the hell is wrong with you if you take your kid to Pride. It's like, oh, why aren't you taking your kid to Pride or to these drag shows and things? And it reminds me of that video from about a year ago, the San Francisco Gay Men's Choir, where they did the little tune about "We'll convert your children," and conservatives freaked out about it. Some libertarians, the good ones, also freaked out about it. I was like, this is wrong and awful and evil and weird and creepy, and these are groomers right here. Literally, they're saying we're going to take your children and convert them. And everyone tried to gaslight us and say, "Oh, you're just being too crazy. You're overreacting. You're pouncing on this." And it's not a slippery slope. Everyone's just joking. We're just trying to make people nicer. And then not even a year later, we've got people like this, a publicly elected official, joking or being serious. Either way, it's a problem about mandatory attendance of drag queens or drag shows to graduate school. So I don't think we're too far off the mark, and maybe it's time to just say, no, we know we're right. You're the ones that are crazy, and it's no more. We're not going to stand for it anymore.
What's insane too about it is, this isn't even under the pretense of health. That's always been the excuse. So for these pushes of, inappropriate sexual content being preached at minors, it's always been, well, we need to teach them sex education for health reasons. And then you look at the content that they're trying to teach, and it's far beyond what a health class should be teaching to kids who are far too young to be absorbing that kind of content. And you realize that it is much more on an agenda that's trying to pervert, your understanding of reality. But this isn't even under that pretense, right? This is Drag Queen 101 for its own sake. This isn't for some health class. This is for the express purpose of normalizing, sexualizing kids. And that is crazy, because no matter what your views on sexual identity and monogamy and, I don't know, the sexual revolution as a whole, no matter what those are, I would hope that our culture can be at least decent enough to recognize that children are not sexual. Children have no place being near and exposed to, and let alone forced into sexual encounters, whether that's horrible abuse of actual physical sexual encounter, or exposed to heavy sexual themes and messaging and events such as drag your kid to pride. Okay, next. The next two we're back on guns here. There's just so many bad gun takes. I couldn't help but throw in a bunch here. This one comes from George Takai. Man, he's just always bad on pretty much everything except for the Japanese internment camps. That's the only thing he's ever been good on.
And he was okay.
And even
on
then,
Star
he
Trek.
still won't. Yeah, well, okay, yeah, he's good in Star Trek. I mean, take wise, but anyway, Officer Sulu writes,
yes.
Crazy thought, but those 20 million AR-15s now in this country could sure arm a lot of Ukrainians. And to me, I almost want to say, well, it's like, yeah. Why is
we
that?
We need 40
George?
million. It sounds like.
Why would it help the Ukrainians? I thought that you couldn't fight off a government with AR-15s. I thought that we were always told it's ridiculous to have the Second Amendment, like we're going to be able to stop a big government. And yet you're saying that these guns would be helpful for a population fighting off a tyrannical government next door. I don't get it, George. It seems like there's a little bit of inconsistency there. I really like that, because a lot of people will, say, oh, it's not meant against the fighting against tyranny. What, you're going to take on the government that has tanks and airplanes and stuff? And then on the other hand, they're like, wow, Ukraine, the underdog, is taking on Russia. And it's like, we got to support them. It's like, which way is it? Okay, is taking on a government a foregone conclusion, or are they so dangerous that we need to send them right away to Ukraine to have a chance against Russia?
You see, it's so close to being based in that you just need to add a little bit more, like, I guess if you're going to have a government, at least have them pay for guns so that everyone can have one, right? So why not? Yeah, we should have 20 million AR-15s shipped over to Ukraine, and we should also have about 50 million AR-15s given to everyone here in the United States. It's mandatory for people to own it, because we don't want to have what happened to Ukraine happen to us. We want to make sure that we're protected against big bad Russia all the way across the world. Yeah, it's I think it was some Japanese general, and maybe this is a myth, and maybe I'm going to get called on it later, but Basically it's like, hey, we'll never invade the U.S. mainland because if we make landfall and we start proceeding towards the Midwest, behind every blade of grass would be, a gun or a rifle or someone willing to defend it. And that's really true, in a lot of ways, just through the fact that I think there's like 400 million guns in the United States. There's more guns than there are people. But just by that sheer number, in a lot of ways, the gun control issue is null and void, right? There's no amount of law, no amount of regulation is going to be able to get rid of that number of guns. You might be able to transfer it. You might be able to take all of these guns out of the hands of normal private citizens that will never use them for violence other than for defense. You might be able to take them away from them, but then the percentage of guns will just be like, okay, people that have ill intentions have them, and then the government has them. I don't know if you saw it, but in Kirkland, they're doing like a buyback. And they're offering for really, really nice AR-15s. They're offering $250. In a gift card, in like some Visa gift card for that. It's like, okay, yeah, that's really going to do well, to offer that. There have been other buybacks, throughout the country where they just say any gun and we'll give you a flat amount of dollars or whatever for it. And so then people will 3D print or make their own and turn them in, which I think is hilarious. And I was kind of hoping for that because Kirkland's a pretty rich city. So I was assuming they would have the budget to fund other exploits of mine. But yeah, it's just unfortunate. It's like George Takei, like he gets the, just like he got the Japanese internment camp thing. Like, it's like, oh yeah, dude, like, who did that? It was the government, and it was a Democratic president that did that. He gets that right and understands that, but can't draw the conclusion that like, oh shoot, like maybe that's also happening today, and maybe what led to that back then we should avoid so it doesn't happen today. He can see across the whole world the effectiveness of AR-15s, yet he can't see it in his own backyard.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's, I think the idea of this post is that we should be removing guns from here to help gun violence and give them to Ukraine to defend it. But then you almost want to say, well, gee, George, do you want there to be school shootings in Ukraine? Because if it's the guns permeating the society, like the claim of the gun control people has always seemed to be, aren't you just wishing that now on Ukrainians? I don't think you can have a Ukraine emoji in your name if you do that. I think that disqualifies wishing school shootings on another country. So it is just a very basic cognitive dissonance, logical inconsistency, because he either has to take the L on the effectiveness of them in Ukraine, or he has to take the L on the effectiveness of them here at home. And it just seems like it's a lose-lose, and I don't even know if he knows how badly he owned himself. Okay, and finally, we have kind of a culmination of a couple of things like we were talking about, like your Joy Behar example from The View here. Salon tweeted this, and the article is still up, but it's under a new headline, and I got this screenshot before they changed it because they got such lashback. And they tweet out, when Ronald Reagan's racism saved lives, armed black men meant immediate gun control. Now, I will say, this is funny because they try to spin this as a positive thing, because it was like, look, the racism helped save lives, and they mean it in sort of an ironic, like, look at this evil thing causing good. But obviously it came off totally wrong. But it highlights the fundamental issue with gun control is that it really does have racist roots. Gun control is a product of trying to make sure that people who the privileged government elites in society were able to, push down. They didn't want them to be equal on an equal playing field. And because that's what guns do, is they equalize humans. They make them equal, as we've been saying this whole time. And so if you're not familiar, but basically the Black Panthers, which was this organization of radical black people who advocated for the rights of blacks, very big proponents of the Second Amendment. They had a bunch of guns, and they sort of paraded around in the California legislature when Ronald Reagan was governor there. And this freaked them out and it stirred them up. And so they immediately passed gun control in the next legislative session. And so it's funny. There's a lot of things that are funny just with that story, with this highlight and this headline. But I'm just going to just really quickly circle back to this headline. Just hear it again. When Ronald Reagan's racism saved lives, armed black men meant immediate gun control. These are the people who will lecture you for having someone slightly controversial on your show and like interviewing them and asking them and challenging them on things, right? They would cancel Dave Smith for debating Nick Fuentes. Not even for saying, oh, Nick Fuentes made a good point. For saying, for debating him, for challenging him, for being on the same platform as him. And then they just kind of go out and casually tweet something like, Ronald Reagan's racism saved lives. It was a good thing in this context. Now, I don't want to cancel Salon over this myself. I don't think they should be silenced but I think we should mock them. I think they should absolutely be laughed at and shown that they are these woke scold moralizers who don't adhere to their own principles and they just want everyone else to live within arbitrary and impossible constraints that they themselves will not abide by, because when it comes down to it, they're really the racists, and they're kind of just sneering at you from their high towers.
Yeah, it's the as Ben Shapiro calls it, the strange new respect that Republicans get when they do something authoritarian or when they die, right? Like the Democrats really love a dead Republican. They hated John McCain while he was alive, but then once he died, he was the maverick that could have made anything work, and he was anti-Trump, so he was principled. And maybe we didn't agree, but at least he was principled. This is like that times 10, because it's like trying to be like, oh yeah, Ronald Reagan was good because he did gun control, but he's a Republican and he's kind of the prototypical example conservatives give. So he's also bad because of racism, but also good that black men wanted to have guns, but good that they were taken away. And it's just so convoluted and crazy. It's so clear that the only, the principle that they have, which is the only truth is power. They're trying to make their point to get what they want. They use their speech to get what they want, not to discover or to reveal truth, but to lord control over you. And it reminded me of Spike Cohen was talking about. He did this tweet about like in Europe. The government of the United States sees Ukraine as our ally, so we seek to arm them, and we see Russia as our enemy, so we seek to disarm them. Now do that to yourself, right? The U.S. government wants to disarm you, and in this point, right, they want to disarm the Black Panthers. They view the Black Panthers as their enemy. So what does that say about us, right? That means that the government views you and me, our brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, people that are, by the vast majority, 99.99%, peaceful, defensive-minded gun owners. They view us as the enemy, and they want to disarm us. That should be enough, right, for you to be like, I don't think I'm going to do that. I don't think I'm going to do that. I'm not going to defend Ronald Reagan. Like, people try and use this as like a gotcha. It's like, nah, I think he's a president, and I think he was probably evil. Just by the very fact that he tried to, and he did end up getting that part of the office, and then did a bunch of stuff that was just not good. The fact that you want to control other people's lives, by definition to me, means that you're probably not a good person. So I'm not going to defend Ronald Reagan or try and like spin this. It's like, yeah, he probably disarmed them, and it was a very bad decision. And yeah, I can also not necessarily like, certain individual Black Panthers, if they were doing violent things or hurting innocent people. But that doesn't negate the principle of the fact that people are allowed to defend themselves. And usually the people that want to disarm the people that want to defend themselves are the villain. And they do it because they view the people that are innocent as their enemy or their subjects.
Yeah, I like, what you're saying about, I'm not going to defend Ronald Reagan, and they treat it like a gotcha, as if, one person, who you and I are not Republicans, and we may have come from that as a past, but, the point here is that there's principles, right? So it's like, you could tell me, and you could present me irrefutable proof that Ron Paul actually supported foreign intervention his whole life, and I would be gutted. I would be devastated. I would be mournful. But I wouldn't be like, well, shoot, Are my principles true? Because they're not contingent on Ron Paul. He just articulates the principles well, and he's a great example of living those principles. And if he turns out to be not a great example, that's heartbreaking and devastating. But it doesn't change the principles. And so I don't really care if Ronald Reagan was racist or not. He probably was. Like a lot of people were, and that's sucky. And doing enacting a policy like gun control out of racism, yeah, that adds up. Government enacting a policy because of racism, yeah, that seems just par for the course for the government. all you've proven to me is that the government sucks more. It's kind of like how people say even the NRA wants a bump stock rifle ban, and I'm like, yeah, because the NRA sucks on that. Like, that doesn't change the principles of gun ownership. There are plenty of advocacy groups that don't hold to that thing. And, the NRA endorses the senators that are the Republicans that are compromising on your Second Amendment rights right now in the Senate. As like even these Republicans come along. It's like, just because some people suck on it doesn't change the principle. I don't understand why that's supposed to make me rethink my principle. Maybe I'll go back, double check. Last time I checked, let's see, we want to be equal. We have the right to self-defense. Government shouldn't use force on us. Yep. Great. Okay. Second Amendment stands.
That's it. Did you see the the 10 Republicans or whatever that are going to jump ship for the gun control bill with red flag laws and stuff? Okay. Yeah. So, the worst bills and laws in history have all been bipartisan. They've all been bipartisan. And so these people will say things like, oh, even the Republicans support this, or even the NRA supports this, as if who supports it negates what they're actually trying to push through. It's like, no, like the worst things have been, whether it's the Iraq War or whether it is the COVID CARES Act, right? Which, everyone's suffering right now. It's June of 2022. We're in a bear market. Things are crashing down. Gas is an all-time high. And it was a bipartisan bill that was passed, the CARES Act, which created all this, right? That printed the $6 trillion that got us to where we are today. So all of the worst things in the world, I don't give a rip about whether who does what or who supports who, because our loyalty is to principle. And that's the only way to operate in a world where you can't know everything, because you have to be ongoingly evaluating stuff, and you have to have something to evaluate against. And if it's against a person, you're hosed. There's no way to actually act in the world that way. You're going to get blasted as a hypocrite, because you will be a hypocrite. You have to actually have some sort of moral bedrock. And yeah, like you're saying with Ron Paul, it's like Ron Paul's a great communicator of all of these different principles. But if tomorrow we learn that he was secretly, a Fed, or he was secretly, God forbid, a statist, like, I'd be like, okay, that sucks, and it's really sad, and it looks like our hero wasn't actually the person he was. But that doesn't change, what they stood for, or what the principles that they advocated for. And yeah, like Ronald Reagan, who cares? But like, if he's known as like some conservative hero that wanted, this two-way absolutionist, like, okay, like I support that aspect. I don't support how he acted. So that's all I have to say on it.
Yeah, nope, I agree. All right, I think that wraps us up for this episode. Thank you guys for listening. If you want to leave a like and a comment, subscribe, share, all those buzzwords, we appreciate it. We'll see you on the next one.